Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahe Tejasvinavaditamastu ma vidvishavahe. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Okay, so we're at the end of the personality chart, and when we look at Sukha, happiness, which we're about to embark on now, in order to do that, we have to have the right to gain happiness in truth. We have to have the right type of knowledge, invest in the right type of knowledge, because that will determine your direction of where you're heading. So if you've got sattvic knowledge, it's determining that you refine your spiritual well-being. If it's rajasic knowledge, it's going to determine that your focus is very much within the world. With no knowledge, tamasic, is determining your spiral downwards. So the choice of knowledge determines your actions, determines what type of actor you become, and that consistency of purpose is necessary in terms of how you make your decisions with your intellect. Your intellect determines the type of decision you're going to make, and without that consistency of purpose, just one good distinction of what you should do and what you ought not to do isn't enough. You've got to nullify all your past and where you're going in the present to make what that product is in the future. So now we're going to be looking at sattvic, rajasic, tamasic happiness. We're actually complete the verse before, which is indicating perhaps the way we work, the way we do anything will determine the product. And in everything that we do, consciously, unconsciously, we're always after that Sukha, that fulfillment, the happiness, the product. In the way we will look at the backlog of our desires and how we direct them in our activities, how we relinquish the fruit, enabling that to become second nature, thus not having the expectation of the product, is what will make the difference in our evolution and gaining that Sukha. So let's just start on 36.
Sukham tvidanim trividam shrunu me bharatarsabha abhyasadramate yatra dukkhantam cha nigacchati.
Isha, if you could read that verse.
In verse 36, and now hear indeed from me, O Bodhisattva, the threefold happiness where one by practice rejoices and ends sorrow. Krishna addresses Arjuna at Bodhisattva, meaning bull among Bodhisattvas. The Bodhisattva race was acclaimed the highest. And
sorry, apologies, Isha. Tim, you had something?
I know. So Isha has read the verse and is going into the commentary.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
We had gone through it last week, but we'll go through again. So essentially, this name Bharatashaba is referring to Arjuna of being part of the Bharata race. He's a Rishabha, so that's meant to be the best of that race, which is meant to be the best of races, as it were. Bharata, meaning that spiritual light within. So it's talking about the Bharata, the bull amongst the Bharatas. You are that. You're the one who puts in the maximum effort and expects the least. The animal does that. The bull, it's worked and it expects the least. Whereas human beings do quite the contrary. We expect the most and want to put in the least effort. We want to get away from our obligations, our activity, and hence that's what tires us and stresses us. So we need to just consider the quote by Ramatirtha, intense work is rest. Doesn't matter what predicament you're in, what the scenario is, mentally you keep your focus on that intensity of doing as much as what you ought to do that you can. That keeps your mind at rest. So let's we can read the commentary on this. Thanks, Isha.
The Bharata race was acclaimed the highest, and bull considered the finest specimen among animals. A bull toils all day without expecting anything in return. It seems to follow the principle, maximum work, minimum profit, which reflects Arjuna's attitude in his field of activity, thus ranking him foremost among the Bharata race. Krishna asked Arjuna to listen to the threefold happiness, Sattvic, Rajasic, and Tamasic Sukha. Sattvic Sukha alone is true happiness. The other two appear as happiness, but are not so. Living with this clear understanding, one attains Sattvic happiness, rejoices all through life.
So following those various constituents in terms of the sattvic qualities is what will gain you this sattvic product. So that's what we have to get onto in terms of one's spiritual evolution. Let's go. 37.
Yattadagre vishwamiva pariname mritopamam tatsukham satvikam prokmam atma buddhi prasadajam.
Tim, you could read the verse.
Verse 37. What is like poison in the beginning and nectar in the end? That happiness is declared Sattvika, a blessing born from clarity of one's intellect.
So the thing to remember in this verse is poison in the beginning, nectar in the end. When you have a clarity of intellect, buddhi prasada, that's sattvic happiness. So it's like poison. It's like when we don't feel like we want to do something, but we know we got to do it. So you've got to put in the effort. It takes consistency of purpose to get it. And you've got to keep your focus and vision on track of your ideal. So you don't get enchanted by the quick fixes or the instant pleasures, which are always dangling in front of you. So you've got to keep yourself away intelligently from those indulgences which might tempt you, until it becomes quite second nature that you don't want those things. So initially it feels a little bit torn that you take yourself away from the things which look pleasurable. But actually, as you develop in your process and in your mind, in your thinking, you don't actually want those things which seem nectarine in the beginning, because there's actually not that, because they become sickly later, poisonous to you. So in every aspect, whether it be focusing on your thoughts, you're looking at your thoughts, your emotions, your actions, you're looking at the permanent aspect of life. So you don't want to give that up. You got to cultivate that bigger value, which is holding that universal value, that thread throughout everything. So it starts with the early morning study and reflection, because that's where you get a different perception with no distractions away from all the riffraff which starts later in the day, the nonsense. So at the mental, physical, and intellectual level, you're tuning in onto something higher. You refine your body to keep yourself in good nick, to be able to think on the higher values. So you mentally keep peeling away those distractions. So you go through that jnana yoga, karma yoga, that hatha yoga you've got to go through too. Keep yourself in good nick. Karma yoga, bhakti yoga, that feeling of devotion, that identification. And that understanding, it's, you don't feel like doing something, but you might not feel like getting up and studying in the beginning, or reflecting on higher thoughts, making use of that best time. But you cultivate it. It might feel a bit, you're changing your day of life, if it's rajasic, to something more refined. It's tough to do it. It's like any exercise, it's tough to do it. But once you get into the rhythm, it becomes quite pleasurable, nectarine. But you don't want to leave that. Even in your food habits, once you become eating quality food, you don't want to eat junk. You don't really want to go out to any restaurant and eat, because it's rubbish on the whole. Even Michelin, you want to eat simple, straightforward food, which is quality. You have to go to the restaurant, you go. And now and again, if your taste buds push you there, you go and have it. But once you get into that, you don't want to have it. Same with your emotions. Once you start refining your emotions on the higher values, you don't want to get into all the nonsense and the gossip and things which would distract you. So it's a real discipline, because the mind's very tricky. It slips, gets into that attachment. So it's a constant focus on the higher value, clarity of intellect, which gives you that nectarine, that pleasure. Understanding that you've got to work on it, which is tough. And it's actually through the struggle not to succeed that you get the benefit. So the pleasure is actually in the abstinence of the object of being, but it's a mental abstinence, not physical. Doesn't mean you lock yourself away. It's quite the contrary. It's in the mental abstinence that you gain the pleasure. So it's that intense work is rest, no expectation, a clear vision that becomes nectarine in the end. So it's not in the beginning palatable. Everybody wants to discard it. And in life, there's always two forks in the road to go that way or that way. So you have to have sufficient knowledge in order to not be the fool who rushes in where angels fear to tread. This quote is, I think. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. So you recognize what is that rajas or tamas. Because you have those higher values in your mind, which you've been studying, reflecting on. It's more difficult to recognize if you don't have that background within yourself. See, the study and reflection is only to draw out what's already there. You're not conjuring something up which is far, far away. It's already with you. So that education is just leading out that truth from within you. That's nectarine. Sattvic happiness is just opposed to rajasic happiness, which is in the next verse we're coming, is nectar in the beginning. It looks very appealing, tantalizing, nice, and disastrous in the end. Doesn't bring you what you're after. Let's read it.
The commentary on verse 37. Sattvika happiness is defined as that which feels like poison in the beginning and ends as nectar, a happiness derived from pursuit of the Supreme Self. As your mind turns away from the world to the self within, it becomes relatively calm. With a calm mind, your intellect develops clarity. You then understand the limitations of material acquisition and sensual pleasure. Your intellect doesn't allow the mind to indulge in them. The practice of abstinence causes initial pain and suffering. It feels like poison to stay away from the erstwhile worldly indulgence. A sattvika person with a strong intellect, however, pursues his determined course to the higher. A spiritual discipline may not be pleasing in the beginning, but through practice it turns enjoyable. Continuing his path, the seeker's joy enhances. Thus, sattvika happiness gradually increases to culminate in the nectar of spiritual enlightenment.
Mm-hmm. So you revel in that bliss. There's a momentum on the route. There's a clarity. You know why you're doing what you're doing. There's a peace of mind, rest. The abstinence is mental. It's not necessarily, you may have initial physical abstinence from objects and beings, but it's actually mental, which means if you have a mental abstinence, you can contact any object as much as you like or being. It doesn't diminish the value because it's mental abstinence. That's what's to be cultivated. If you remember in chapter 3, he says physically withdrawing, but mentally indulging. One's a hypocrite because so there's no point just physically. So that focus on the bigger value enables you to relate properly with no expectation. Let's go to Rajasic, and then we will discuss. Vidya. Let's go. 38.
विषयेन्द्रिय संयोगात् यत्तदग्रे मृतोपमम् Pariname Vishamiva Tatsukam Rajasam Smritam.
Guru, if you could read the verse.
Verse 38. The happiness arising from contact of sense organ with object, which in the beginning is like nectar and in the end like poison, that is considered Rajasica.
So when you think about it, from the moment we wake up, we're going into the world to gain some sort of happiness, and we have our senses that we want to get satiated in whatever we're doing in our work. In Sankaracharya's Vivekachudamani, he mentions 5 different animals which get destroyed because of their attractions. The moth to the light, the deer to the, I think it's the sound of the drum, the elephant to the scent, the bee, it goes into the flower and it is encapsulated with a taste. So all the senses are what demolishes us. It takes in that stimuli. And then the mind, if it doesn't have capacity of intellect, it demolishes us. So from beginning of the day till night, we're constantly being tantalized by what the objects and beings are in the world to get our satiation through the senses, to get that fix. So we're always looking for nectarine things, that instant pleasure contacted through the senses. We always want that nectar, whether it be something we eat, something we feel. We want to be entertained in our emotions. We want to be entertained in our thoughts. Everything is sensational. So it seems pleasurable in the beginning, but it's got a consequence to it. It has a diminishing value, first of all. Anything which is nectarine as such, contacted from outside. You can't make the world stay static, it changes, so the value also diminishes. And on your first contact, there's a grand pleasure, but when you keep contacting the object or being with that intention of gaining a sensation, a pleasure, it being nectarine, and it diminishing, you have to keep contacting that to keep up that same pleasure. And it doesn't work. It keeps diminishing. So the more you contact, the faster it diminishes until there's no pleasure whatsoever. It's absolutely neutralized in oneself. And then we go on the chase for the next sensation. Or we are so attached or addicted to whatever it is that we thought was giving us a pleasure. We fuel it forever for absolute no growth, no pleasure, no progress, but we're attached to that object or being. So it becomes poisonous in the end. But it appears nectarine in the beginning. Rajasic happiness brings you to neutralization. So to the extent one indulges, if you think about it, you've got to at least neutralize it, is to the extent you've got to abstain too. So it's a mental abstinence. That's what makes a difference. It's not running away. Spiritual evolution isn't running away from objects, beings, relationships, or anything. It's actually a mental attitude. But when there's no mental attitude, clarity of intellect going on, you're actually rushing in with your mind to get things fixed from outside rather than fixing it from within. And that's the spiritual path, to fix it, to sort it out, to have a clarity of thought in your intellect, that vision to get to the truth. So the Rajasic person is always trying to get back that original nectar on the first contact. but things just don't stay the same. It would be far more easier if everything in life, you saw something poisonous or distasteful, was just that and didn't have anything else to it. And everything which was pleasurable was just pleasurable. There's no contradiction to it. It'd be straightforward, but life isn't like that. So that's the understanding where we have to understand this contradiction, the paradox. So the Rajasic person is always trying to get something for nothing, eats without producing, plans to get without earning, plans to take without giving back. So in our spiritual sadhana, we're always emphasizing on karma, putting back, contributing back to that bigger cause, because it helps your growth. So the Rajasic fellow can't conceive that. It's only a take out. You're indebted to begin with, and you indebt yourself more. Rajasic happiness, you feel the fix for the moment, but it soon diminishes. So it's a mental attitude. Let's read the...
Rajasica happiness arises from contact with sense object. When sense organ perceives an object of your liking, you gain pleasure. The pleasure is maximum when the experience is fresh, described as nectarine. The pleasure content, however, wears away as you continue to indulge in it, and prolonged indulgence reduces the pleasure to zero. It is the law of diminishing value. The verse points to that state as being poisonous, meaning painful and sorrowful. Since much effort is involved in keeping the object available for enjoyment with no pleasure therefrom, you thus become neutralized to the enjoyment of that sense object, causing frustration. A person addicted to a sensual pleasure continues to contact the sense object, though he gains no pleasure. Like an alcoholic continues to drink even as he admits he derives no more pleasure from it. He still indulges because he feels miserable without a drink. No pleasure while having it, but displeasure when denied. That is neutralization. Every human is thus neutralized to breathing oxygen. You gain no pleasure from breathing, but struggle and suffer if it is denied. Likewise, with the use of eyes, ears, limbs, etc., you become neutralized to the pleasures of perceiving and moving.
So we're actually neutralized to many things we take for granted. It's only when they're taken away, how our circulation is, how our sight is, how we have the nature, how we become neutralized to many, many things. So Rajasic happiness. One experiences pleasure in the beginning, of sense contact, and sorrow in the end. So you've got to think about your own examples when, it's this is a very common thing. The whole world is suffering this, wants that instant gratification now. And all the media and advertising is promoting now. Not later.
Parulji?
Tamasic happiness. Can we call it that? Let's chant.
यदग्रे चानुबन्धे च सुखं मोहनमात्मनः निद्रालस्य परं प्रमादोत्तं तत्तामसम् उदाहृतम्.
So, Tamasic happiness. Tim, if you could read the verse.
Verse 39. The happiness delusive of self in the beginning and in the sequel, arising from sleep, indolence, and heedlessness, that is said to be Tamassica.
So, arising from sleep of one's intellect, of one's even slothful. It's heedless. It doesn't think of any consequence to others. One takes, if any, it comes out of idleness, laziness. One plans things which, if any, which are totally contrary to any ordinance, scriptural ordinance, or any actual material ordinance in that sense. So it actually spirals you down to total disaster. So at the rate at which you employ tamas spirals you to your own disaster. The consequences are that recklessness. There's no awareness of anything but oneself to satisfy one's own needs, base needs. You might think of smuggling something. They're all deeds which are, if any, are going on upside down. How can I get something for nothing? You'll even cheat to get it. Idle. Think it's better to, it's happy to stay partying 4 o'clock in the morning. A sattvic person is thinking it's happy to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. It's just the reverse. Because going to bed at 4 o'clock in the morning actually ruins your day. So you've got to pay the price. And if you do it consistently, you'll have no capacity to even do the rajasic material life. Heedless, recklessness. And that's actually promoted these days as, you know, in the culture, go and have a whole load of drinks. Now, since COVID, it's less of that, I guess, because it's less of it in that way. But just go and drink yourself to death, as though that's your outlet and happiness. It's totally tamasic. That's your high. So there's an epidemic of drug and alcoholism in the society, and nobody's understanding why, what's happening. And that's considered to that individual as the high as the happiness. It's getting rid of the pain. Sukha, getting rid of that sorrow in the most destructible way, thinking it's actual, that recreational way is not recreational. Sattvic, Tamasic, temporary kick, without consideration to anybody else. It spirals down from that rajas to tamas. No bigger value in place, lack of values being offered. And you can't blame anyone. It just happens when one's not in that environment. Keep cultivating the low value without realization. So the society, the whole Bhagavad Gita is about keeping the higher values in place, resurrecting your positive tendencies over your negative tendencies, that reinforcement of cultivating positive values. So you don't fall a prey to the tamasic. You won't chase tamasic happiness once you know what it is. You try and get away from it as much as you can. And rajasic too, you cultivate that sattva. Let's read it.
Tamassica Sukha is happiness you experience through ignorance of your supreme self, a happiness delusive of self from the very beginning, arising from sleep, indolence, and heedlessness. When you are asleep or ignorant of a malady, you are not mentally disturbed. You are blissfully unaware of it. Such happiness arising from ignorance is Tamassica. Similarly, the joy coming from indolence, sloth, laziness, a temporary pleasure one enjoys through idleness, shirking one's duty and responsibility. Such misplaced happiness also is considered Tamassica. A third way of gaining ephemeral joy or satisfaction is through heedlessness, an indifference towards what one does and its consequence. The pleasure gained thus is categorized as Tamassica.
Mm-hmm. So, whoever you are, wherever you're at, just focus on doing your activities, wherever it's at, rajasic, or it's tamasic, rajasic. So keep doing your activities, build that momentum, build that knowledge base so you can direct the direction of where you want those activities to refine you and land. So you actually cultivate inevitably, or if not, so now that's sattvic happiness, that product as such. It's a different in kind. So this personality chart is where we can make our own graphs of all the constituents. It gives us if you remember at the beginning, it gives us information on where we are at spiritually. We don't really need to look at where somebody else is at. It's about where we are at. We can examine what we need to do, what we need to refine. I don't worry about anybody else. So it gives all the constituents of our activities. So perhaps, I don't know if anybody's got any examples or any questions. We've got time today before we move further. Tim.
It's very easy to read these 3 verses on the different types of sukha, happiness, but I find it's too easy to read it. It's difficult to apply it to one's life because so much of it is hindsight, looking back. Or maybe I'm not understanding it properly.
So,
like, for example, I could go into a cafe and order a glass of apple juice. Or I could plant a seed of an apple tree and let it grow for 10 years and then harvest the fruit and make an apple juice. Is one different from the other?
So they're 2 different activities. If you're thirsty, you might want the apple juice. If you understand, if you're diabetic, it depends circumstantial. If you're diabetic, you won't want the apple juice. You make an informed decision at the time. If you've got foresight, you may not have the apple juice altogether. You may have water. You may plant the tree for the fact that that's what your nature is, and that's what you ought to be doing for yourself. So so the criteria is not so much what you do, but actually what your thought and direction is.
But neither the apple or the apple juice is directly related to the self.
That's your thought. You see, your perception, your emotion and thoughts all getting directed to yourself, your activities getting directed to the self. So in each of these constituents, you're directing, if it's Sattvika, to the self. So you're awake, you gain knowledge to keep your thoughts, perceptions, emotions focused on something bigger. So in your activities, you've got to focus on something bigger. So you standardize your life so you're enabled to focus on something bigger. You avoid things which will take your mind away from the bigger picture. So you may avoid things like eating foods which damage your health, because it's actually, you've got to keep your health to strive for something bigger. You can't be focused on that. So that's one aspect of it. You take in a higher value in your knowledge. That's one aspect of it. Your activities are of service rather than of self-interest. That's one aspect of it. So every part of your day becomes the act of worship, an act of service. And in order to do it well, you've got to make informed decisions of how you keep yourself. You know, should I shop till I drop, or should I standardize? I only need X amount of clothing. I need to eat X sort of food. I need X amount of possession. It's all a standardized, which keeps your mind still on track of the higher value. How can I be of service to, is it in my community, or is it in my society? Or if I'm just of service to one family, then I'll miss being of service to a global community. So you're always making decisions informed with that higher goal, depending upon what your vasanas are. You may not go out into the community at all. A scientist may be making something for a global good. They're constantly with themselves. They don't have time to go mingle, socialize. So it depends on what your nature is, but all the thoughts backing it are in direction of the self. So you can have the apple juice if you fancy. You may avoid it if it's going to upset your physical or mental well-being. Such you can, you may not have time to grow food if you're talking and lecturing to offer knowledge. But at the same time, you may be selective in what you eat because you want to eat quality food. You may have a nature where that's what you need to do. Grow, it's your swadharma. And then you have to do that. You may have to grow your food rather than eat from the shop and plastic and all. So you're always making informed decisions to take you to the higher in your every facet of life. The more you tune into that in terms of your study and reflection in the morning hours, the more it comes to mind when you're actually in your day. And those distractions which creep in your introspection, you can reflect on them and look at them and think, I did this today. Okay, don't worry about it. Let's try and up it tomorrow or whenever. So there's a constant program of refinement going on. The focus is to get to the truth. That makes sense. So I may be entertaining a lower value. I got a strong desire in a particular direction. I can't get myself off it. So start refining the other values and slowly that will drop. Focus, get the understanding I've got a distraction in this particular value and it's jolting everything else. So then start to refine a bigger value and start to understand what keeps you going to the value which is negative to your cause, and then slowly let it drop off. Think about how you can do it. So it's a constant pursuit of not getting the quick fix, actually enjoying life in the work and the high value that you pursue. Intense work, rest. So one choice is not necessarily better than the other. It depends who you are. Once you realize it, see a choice for a vegetarian cannot eat an animal. It's like murder. A choice for a vegan cannot drink milk because it's like taking the baby away from the mother for that cause. You can't do it. So this becomes acutely within you. But for another person, there's no harm in it because that's where their level of thinking is. So it's yet to be refined. It's a universal harmony you're aiming at. And people do it in different ways. One person may do it in activities more predominantly, another person in knowledge or various different ways we do it.
Thank you. I think Isha has a question.
Isha, go ahead.
Thank you. So I've got a question. It's more of a, a practical application question. So if we are aware that, let's say, through doing this personality chart, or just generally aware that our actions, we are cultivating Tamasic and Rajasic tendencies through a change in our actions, and we're completely aware of it, but we're finding it difficult to pull ourselves out of it and go back to those sattvic tendencies through our practice, because let's say we're becoming resistant to the practice that helps us get to that place. Do you have any suggestions or of how to pull ourselves out of that, and when we're fully aware, and as you said, maybe it's the let out or release that we think we need, but we're finding it difficult to just come back to where we were at?
So first of all is to acknowledge that there must be a strong desire in the environment where you are at. So it pulls you into that. You have a strong desire for some aspect of it. So it's pulling you there. So for whatever reason, you've got to fulfill that. If you're aware that that's not exactly what you want to be doing, if you cannot help yourself, the first principle in the chapter 3 is you've got to start by physically removing yourself from that environment. Give yourself the chance to breathe and look at it objectively, so you can actually go back into the environment and apply yourself with some bigger value. But in order to do that, simply being aware and having knowledge isn't sufficient. There needs to be some reflection on that knowledge, to digest that knowledge, to actually make it yours so you can actually be practical with it. So a person might have knowledge, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are actually aware. We have knowledge. Many people have knowledge. I have knowledge. I'm not perfect in everything, but I'm prepared to put in the efforts to do it. That's the focus. So that, to that extent, I will evolve myself to that height. And so each one of us has to do that. So as you take yourself away physically, there's no point taking yourself away physically. If you take an addict away from a drug physically, if you don't feed them with some understanding or knowledge, higher knowledge, which will enable them to be practical to what they can do, they'll go straight back into the addiction. So same with us in terms of our desires. We'll go back in feeling there's a need, because we go with the herd. Everybody's pushing in the direction of Tamas Rajas. Few people are pushing in the direction of spiritual evolution. But once you get a grasp of, this is a good idea, this is actually where the happiness lies, then you can't forgo it in your heart. You have to do something about it. You know it within yourself. I keep bugging you every day until you start to do something about it. So you've got to put in the effort to put yourself in an environment which will cater to your needs of development. So you've got to put yourself in an environment which will fuel your value system, your higher needs, so you can more easily drop the lower values which you don't want to keep. And then when you're steadfast in that, only then are you put in an environment, of any environment, you won't get into it because you're steadfast in it, you're foolproof in it. But if there's a little bit of here and there, you may get into it. You may actually have to get into it and realize this isn't for me. So you go with the full knowledge, I get into this desire only to get out of it. But you've got to fortify that knowledge in you. If you can't get yourself out of the environment, put yourself in, that's why we say morning study. The environment is quiet, without distractions, nobody's about. Take in that higher knowledge. Let it percolate drop by drop. Slowly, the titration will change from one to another. You'll drop the lower value, but you have to be patient. And the speedier way is to get yourself to somewhere like a place of learning of these higher values, which I always recommend is somewhere like the Academy, ashram setup, where the focus is that of learning the higher values of life. It's only there to fortify the way you live anyway. So it's like living without a manual of life in everyday living until you pitch up the higher values. You think, my God, why didn't I look at this before? So the vasana, the desires get tantalized, the senses get tantalized. That's what makes sense. So you have lots of opportunities to take yourself out of the environment. There is a place called Vedanta Academy, everybody can visit. And there are some events coming up for class members, and there's a retreat and for young people as well as for all of us adults. As a class members experience retreat. Anybody wants to go on that, there's also an international retreat. And for your kids, there's also a youth retreat in December, January and February. We'll put those on the WhatsApp. Anybody else before we go?
Probably it is more of a reflection, I think, of what I have been understanding over a while. So I think for me, the takeaway has been that, all the three stages, I think Sattvic, Rajasic, Tamasic, I think we all probably have been in all these stages, I think, the why. It's just that I think while we, I think, go through these sort of satsangs, I think that we kind of get the knowledge of what should probably be the higher state. Maybe for all I know, probably I'm stuck in a particular place. Probably it is Rajasic. I never knew that there probably was a higher state of being. And it probably opens my eyes on trying to aspire for the higher one. Does not necessarily mean that I probably would be able to get onto the Sattvic path from today itself, but then at least it gives me a constant reminder that there is actually a next level that I can always aspire for. And maybe over a period of time, probably my thoughts might get tuned, and I might really have enough commitment really to kind of walk towards that path, because eventually you should really get convinced that is probably the way for you to go.
Exactly. So it's tickling you to say this is the way you got to go. This is your mission in life, to get onto that sattva. And so, as I was tickling you too, the way to go is let's get to ourselves. I will be there in January, February. Who's coming with me to the Academy? Let's make it. Hang on till next week. Quite right.
Thank you.
Hang on.